This is You Only Know What You Know, a podcast by Compass Health Center about the sometimes messy, always meaningful work of parenting and mental health. I'm Britt Teasdale, a writer, photographer, and parent of 2 young children.
And I'm Beth Holt, a clinician with more than 20 years of experience in youth mental health and a mom of 2 teens. We're here to bring honest conversations, clinical insights, and a little bit of real-life parenting perspective to the table.
Because none of us have it all figured out. We're all just learning as we go, and that's okay. Remember that film from the early 2000s, Failure to Launch, where Matthew McConaughey plays a guy in his mid-30s still living at home, and his parents are so frustrated that they hire someone to essentially engineer his independence for him? It's a comedy, but that phrase, failure to launch, has become part of our cultural vocabulary, and it carries judgment. Reality for many young adults right now is complex. The financial landscape is changing, it's taking longer to graduate from university, rates of anxiety and depression are significantly higher than in previous generations. The path into adulthood is less predictable, and our expectations of what that path should look like really haven't shifted to match.
And that gap between expectation and reality creates a complicated space for families. When a child turns 18, everything changes on paper. They're legally an adult with the right to make their own decisions. But a parent's instinct to protect and support doesn't simply turn off. So the question many parents find themselves sitting with isn't how do I fix this? It's how do I stay connected and supportive while my child finds their own footing?
That tension is really at the center of what we're discussing today. What it looks like to parent at the edge of autonomy. How do you stay present without overstepping? How do you express concern without breaking trust? And how can we tell the difference between avoidance or low motivation versus mental health challenges or overwhelm?
Joining us today are Melissa Blitz and Greta Holt, both of whom work closely with young adults and their families navigating this stage of life. We are so glad you guys are here. To get us started, we'd love for you to share a little bit about yourselves and the work that you do. Let's start with you, Melissa.
Okay, thanks, Beth. I'm Melissa Blitz. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor. I've been with Compass 8 years next week, which is wild. And my whole time here at Compass, and even before, I worked with young adults. And it's really fun to be doing this with Greta. Greta and I have shared many cases with our young adult patients throughout the years. I've worked with young adults in the group setting as an individual primary therapist, and then was one of the directors of the young adult team before shifting into my current role, where I get to do more general over 18 program development for kind of the entirety of Compass, which is very exciting, and still get to focus on that young adult lens as well. I think this is going to be a really complex yet exciting conversation where we can take multiple perspectives and highlight different approaches, but also some of the facts that can't be ignored when someone does step into their 18th year. So really excited to be joining you all today.
I'm Greta Holt. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and this July, I will have been at Compass for 5 years. And that whole time, I have been a family therapist. So doing weekly sessions with our young adult patients, sometimes their significant others, but mostly their parents or other adult caregivers in their life. And yeah, I think I'm kind of in a unique position where age-wise, generationally, I'm kind of smack dab in the middle of most of my young adult patients and their parents. So I think it gives me a unique perspective to kind of see all sides and hopefully bridge that gap a little bit.
Let's set the stage a little bit, if that's okay. You know, as we were kind of saying earlier in the introduction, life looks a lot different for young adults now in 2026 than it did for young adults, let's say in like the late 90s, early 2000s, 20 years ago. So what really has changed? How is life different for young adults now?
I can kick us off with this one. Greta and I had a little bit of a chat last week to discuss, what are the important pieces we really want to bring forward in this hour. And there's so many, but we had this lens of like, all right, what's the difference between like 1996 and 2026? And we just could have talked about that for an entire day. And 3 themes that we pulled out were just like this increased information era where we have people getting access to smartphones or smart devices at such a young age that by the time that they're 18, this is something that they may have had for a decade, if not longer. And so the amount of information, the accessibility of information, the ease of that information, but also like the social connectedness or pull towards those devices is something that was not by any means to the same degree in 1996, where we maybe had dial-up internet at home that did not go into our pocket or our cars or travel with us at all. The other thing that we pulled out is like just this desire to know information, whether it's social information, societal information, educational information. There's just an overabundance. And then once we have that information, what do we do with it? And then things like online dating, accessibility of things like Uber and Lyft that in 1996, someone who was a teenager or young adult didn't have really that much access to.
Yeah, I think that technology was the primary difference, both on our young adult side and also on the parents' side, right? Like our young adults also have a lot more connection to social media and those apps that you're talking about, Melissa, but parents as well when it comes to things like Life 360. A lot of the parents I've worked with utilize that for their young adults, and that gives parents a lot more information as well, but they may not always know kind of how to utilize or what to do with, and that can kind of be overwhelming. So I think the overall thing being there's so much more information and more connectedness, but our ability to discern and be intentional with that has not necessarily kept pace with all of it.
That is such a great point. And it just makes me think, as someone who's a parent of teens, and yeah, actually, they're both teens as of last week. You set up Life 360 for a reason, or you can track location for a reason as you start to hopefully try to give your kids more independence, but also sometimes need to know, or maybe not need, but want to know where they are. So, as a family therapist, are you finding yourself coaching the parents that you're working with on how to detach a little bit, how to allow for more independence when, I mean, you can track your kids' location 24/7 if they're off at college or at a job. Like, when do we tell parents, actually, you should probably turn that off or turn it on selectively when there's a concern? Like, what advice are we giving people?
It can come in handy to uncover struggles that a young adult might be having on the parent side, especially if they're across the country and away at college, for example, to say like, hey, I know my kid's supposed to be in class right now, but I see that they're still in their dorm. And that is often where our parents, by the time they're seeing us, will come in and be like, hey, I noticed that this was starting to happen. And so that alerted me to the fact that my kid might need some additional help. So it can be really helpful in those moments. And a lot of that can continue when maybe the young adult is in treatment and is back home with parents and living with them again. And yet parents are still kind of tracking whether they're going to program, or are they doing errands, or are they out with friends? And that can kind of lose its utility. And so I think a big theme, and this is something that Melissa and I chatted about as well, is part of what we're doing is helping our young adults, especially those that struggle with mental health issues, to discern the difference between when they're unsafe. And that's something that I think we have to teach our parents as well. What's the difference between your kid being uncomfortable, going through a tough time, being able to kind of handle that on their own versus them being unsafe?
That makes me think. So, I spent most of my clinical direct care time working with children and adolescents and families. And really, for kids and teens, there's a place, like, there's sort of a, this is what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be at school. Basically through the end of high school for most people, and ideally have some sort of after-curricular or some sort of job once you hit a certain age, and some family time and some social time. Like, it's pretty standard, I think, in our Western world, in our culture. Once you finish high school or its equivalency, there's such a range that it feels like there's less of a, this is what success looks like, or this is what typical looks like. Certainly there are college-bound kids, there are gap year kids, there are kids who begin working, and that's fantastic. It seems like it's harder to know when people aren't functioning in some of those realms because it's more gray than when they are younger, or maybe full adults when they have to be financially completely independent. I know some young adults do as well, or they are supposed to have a job of some sort if they're able. How do we define baseline functional, for lack of a better word, for young adults?
Yeah, it's a really complicated question. What's tough is, and Greta, I'm sure I would love for you to chime in on this one too, but we see things through our own lived experience unless we take a moment to recognize that and then kind of broaden into a more curious space. And for a lot of parents of young adults, we see a pattern kind of trickle along, which is parents or caregivers have certain expectations based on societal expectations and norms, but also the expectations when they were young adults that seem to translate really seamlessly into here's what you should be doing. And if that's not happening, something might be construed as like wrong. I hope part of this conversation today can be what are maybe ways that we can explore options from like a lens of curiosity and stripping away some judgmental language so that it can be a more equitable conversation involving the young adult and the caregiver, and from a proactive place versus something's not happening and then it's more of like a reactionary, I have to fix X, Y, or Z, which tends to create more of a discrepancy or rupture in the relationship versus coming together and maybe doing some helpful problem solving that takes into account what is it you want? What are the barriers? How can I support you? Versus feeling like life has to go in one certain path.
It is not as linear as maybe it once was, or as we'd like to believe it is, due to just a lot of external factors, right? College is just a lot more expensive now. Job market is really hard. And those things, the economy and everything tends to fluctuate up and down always. But I think the economics of everything combined with just the cost of higher education and what that looks like is really making it challenging to take kind of what we consider that direct course from high school to college to the working world. And I think that's still a big adjustment for our parents, obviously, that looks different than when they were young adults, but also for our young adults who have grown up maybe thinking or assuming that their life would look one way because that's what they always seen from the adults in their life, and having to come to grips with the fact that it just might look a little bit different and that it's all equally valid as long as we're kind of moving forward into the life we want.
And I think that's the piece that's tough is like moving forward. What if someone isn't moving forward? How do we know whether this is like a mental health concern? How do I know when my young adult's experiencing a mental health concern versus when they aren't? And how do I support? I think regardless of what path someone takes, we know that someone having a purpose in their days is good for our mental health. And to me, that ties back to like, what are the values of the young adult and what are the opportunities that align with those values? And are we taking helpful, meaningful, reasonable steps forward? And if not, what's getting in the way? And that question can maybe help us suss out, if there are barriers, are they linked to any mental health concerns? And if so, what does that support look like?
I want to pause for a second and zoom out and define young adulthood. I know at Compass, we separate programmatically and in treatment our young adults from our adolescents and from our adult program because there are so many developmental, lifestyle, like just so many unique factors and challenges and strengths and life experiences specific to that. Could you guys tell us a little bit about young adulthood and what makes it unique from adulthood and adolescence on paper, I guess, because I know it's different?
Roughly talking about folks age-wise 18 to 25. And among that's not always cut and dry because we know that young adults have different levels of maturity, insight, all of that. So what we're really looking at is, as you said, Beth, kind of that commonality of there's some sort of major transition happening. We are in some sort of flux or limbo in terms of moving from adolescence into adulthood. And something we talk about a lot is that our young adults are often legally adults with the brain of an adolescent still, most of the time. And I think that's a really important piece to remember is that there is a biological basis for developmental adulthood. And usually, those frontal lobes in the brain are not formed until we reach age 25. And so our brain is growing and moving and changing very rapidly during that young adulthood.
I actually find this topic really a little funny because when someone turns 18, a lot more options are available legally in terms of like purchases, what could happen societally, even in treatment. It looks different what an 18-year-old is able to do and not do in relation to like family involvement compared to a minor or an adolescent. And yet we know that someone's brain development or prefrontal cortex specifically isn't fully developed until at least age 25. And that's our like decision-making center of our brain. And so it's this unique time where you have way more decisions presented to you. There are maybe more expectations to make certain decisions more independently, or now that you are quote unquote an adult, where those expectations aren't the same for an adolescent, where life is a little bit more pre-prescribed. And so we're saying to these young adults, hey, make good decisions and follow a certain path. And we put so much expectation, yet they have many, many more years until that decision-making part of their brain is actually fully developed. And so this is a really tricky, special time where understanding that information from like a caregiver perspective, but also as a young adult itself of like, it's tricky to make decisions. You have a lot more decisions. What supports do you need? It can be really, really impactful and can help when it comes to navigating this time.
I'm curious, Greta, how you've seen some of that play out in family therapy. I think, listen, you can't make a kid or a teen do anything other than maybe when they're really small. And, I think parents have more control over kids the younger they are than they do as they get older. Melissa, you talked about minors be able to make decisions on their own, and then they're technically adults. Tell us a little bit about the challenges of parenting a young adult when it's even harder to, I don't know what the word, not that you want to make someone do something, but when you see your young adult child struggling, and they lack the insight or the awareness, or they're struggling to the degree that they need help, but they're not buying into it, that can be so much harder for when you're parenting a young adult and when you're parenting a child. How do you address some of that in family sessions?
Yeah, we have to kind of adjust our approach. I think that the same maybe rationale or justifications that we would use when our child was younger just aren't going to cut it anymore, largely because we do have a person here who's coming into their own and who's growing more independent and coming into their own personality and personhood. And we have to shift, I think, from that more kind of authoritative style to more of a collaborative style oftentimes. And one of the things I tell my families is lead with some curiosity, right? This is your young adult's first time being a young adult, and it is your first time, maybe not, but for your first time parenting this specific person as a young adult. And there is no manual that comes with that, and there's a lot of uncertainty and unknowns. And so instead of kind of relying on that, well, I need you to do this because I'm the authority, right? And this is what I'm telling you. It's more, I need you to do this because XYZ, or I'm noticing you're having some trouble doing ABC. Can you tell me what that's about, right? So I think combining curiosity with also your own vulnerability, right? We were all young adults. And I think when your own young adult can hear from your experience that like, I struggled with similar things, that can often increase that connection and their ability to kind of be receptive to more guidance.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, when I think back to when I was a young adult, I wish that I was having conversations with my parents about how my prefrontal prefrontal cortex was not fully developed. Like we weren't having those conversations, and I think if you are struggling during those years, you can start feeling a lot of shame. Like, why aren't I making the right decisions? Or why am I struggling with this? Why is this so hard? It could be a lot of shame in that if you feel like you're a little bit behind from your peers, or you're just like, oh, I keep making kind of dumb isn't the greatest word. But like, why do I keep making these decisions? Right.
But Brett, if my parents would have told me as a young adult that I was not making great decisions because of my developing prefrontal cortex, I don't think I would have been like, that is really interesting. Thank you.
Maybe not at the time, but like maybe after. I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot of shame involved with thinking you should have it all figured out and then making dumb decisions. And if there's like a reason why you keep making not the best choices, like maybe I shouldn't make huge life choices right now because my brain isn't fully developed. I was very headstrong at that age too and didn't listen to my parents. It just got me thinking, like, I feel like there's power in that knowledge.
Yeah, and I think that's the tricky bit is like there's power in the knowledge. It's knowing who are you talking to? Like what does my young adult, what do they value? When do I feel like they hear me? When do I feel like they don't? And kind of gathering that information. And also just like you said, information. We have an abundance of information. And so it's like treading the line of what's useful information and what's maybe clouding the conversation and what is my young adult interested in and what's taking up their time. And those are all questions where like we come back to what young adults have access to and how it's different than what their parents or caregivers had access to. And before we can have any of these conversations, we have to level set of like, what does the landscape of your life look like? What did the landscape of my life look like as a 19, 20-year-old, whatever? And what do I need to understand about your life so that I can best support you? And I think that's a conversation that hopefully cultivates a lot of that vulnerability that Greta was talking about, where we can really start to come together versus seeing it almost as a conflict or a fight, or that one side is right and one side is wrong, which, Greta, I feel like when you see that in your office, I'm curious how you navigate that.
Taking that team-based approach, especially in the therapy space, but I think it's useful just in the household with a young adult. We are now both adults, technically, right? My parent and the child. And there's still going to be obviously an imbalance in that relationship, right? Between it'll always be parent and child, but it's also now two adults. And that's going to require more of a collaborative approach than as much of a kind of top-down approach, that kind of authoritative parenting style that I was speaking to before. And really getting clear that blame doesn't really have much of a role here. I think it's useful to know what isn't working. When we do make kind of those dumb decisions, we need to talk about it and have that called into the conversation, and doing that so that it becomes a learning opportunity for both the young adult and their parent, not so we shame someone, blame someone, so that it becomes necessarily punitive, but so that we can learn from it and learn together. I hear a lot from parents that I work with that, well, I'm being so directive and kind of maybe micromanaging because I don't want my kid to make the same mistakes that I did. I hear that a lot. And that is it's so valid to feel that way, because you love your kids so much and just want to protect them and kind of keep them in this bubble. And you feel like if I had this experience and I made the mistake, if I can prevent them from going through that hurt, that pain, that danger, whatever it is, I want to be able to do that. And I think that's when we have to think back to when we were young adults ourselves and say, well, I only know that now because I went through it, right? And so how can I still be that safety net and that support for my young adult while making sure that they have their own chance to have these learning opportunities?
What we haven't talked about yet is like the emotional experience of the caregivers, and how, when something happens, when something doesn't go the way we anticipated, or if our young adult made a mistake, however we define that, it makes sense that the caregiver is going to have a potentially very strong emotional reaction. And regardless of what age you are, when we do have heightened emotions, we tend not to be the most effective communicators or make the most mindful decisions. And so, as much as we're focusing on the young adult, any person at any age is susceptible to heightened emotion, especially when we care so deeply about our kiddo, that even that psychoeducation for caregivers or parents is, hey, like, if you're feeling really upset, which is valid, it's not the time to have a conversation. Like, we need to think about ways that we make sure both parties are regulated so that we can come together and problem solve. And I would love for everybody to have this information at like the age of 5, but a lot of us go through life not knowing this until maybe we are seeking support or treatment, and we learn some of that information that can help us make those decisions on when to approach and have a conversation versus when we maybe need some time to cool off and ground ourselves.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And a topic that keeps coming up in all of our conversations on this podcast is the idea of connection and connecting with our children, no matter what the age. And so it sounds like, even if you are feeling so scared and worried for your young adult that they're going to repeat the same mistakes you did, or you're just terrified that something bad is going to happen, really bringing it back to that connection piece kind of sounds like a good way to ground. I want to bring it back again to when we were talking about young adults and the prefrontal cortex, and then also what mental health challenges you're seeing right now.
Yeah, I think now we're seeing a lot of young adults who probably either started high school or in the middle of high school during the height of the COVID pandemic. And that is having a huge impact on just kind of that diagnostic makeup that we're seeing in folks. Social anxiety comes up a lot, I think, in part due to those experiences during those key developmental years. That socialization just looked so different. And people felt really isolated. So there's a lot of social anxiety, depression, for sure, right? A lot of feelings of loneliness, comparison to other peers, where I think we touched on this earlier, but this person is already in college, already has a job, is already set to go. I'm feeling behind. That contributing to some of those feelings of depression. And a lot of kind of cross diagnostic presentations with things like ADHD, where ADD is coming up a lot as well. And I think that's partly because we're better at diagnosing that now than we were in the past. Especially when folks are a bit younger, but seeing a lot of that crossover between issues with executive functioning and how that meets up with things like depression and anxiety. And that makes each of those things a little more challenging to navigate without additional help.
So I imagine a lot of the things you just named didn't start when young adults turned 18. A lot of our listeners are parenting children and adolescents. Many are also parenting young adults. But are there things that we can do as parents proactively um, to set our kids up for success in terms of young adulthood? And again, knowing that success looks different for each child, each young adult, each family, but some of the life skills and coping strategies or preparing to be more independent, whatever that looks like, are there some things that we can do now with our kids and teens to help support them into young adulthood, regardless of whether mental health things are coming up, which I know will be an impact either way?
I think there are, and it's going to look different for every kiddo because everyone has different needs and every family dynamic is different. And I think the only way a system is going to survive is if there's buy-in and agreement between the young adult or the adolescent and the caregivers. And so it's making sure that whatever we are proposing or hoping for is mutually agreed upon and that there's ability to have a conversation and to compromise when needed. And that leads me to think about like there's two categories that go on in my brain are like what are the non-negotiables? Like what are things that are important, essential for your well-being? And also where do we have a little bit of flexibility where it is known that these are maybe options that you have more independence or agency around. And if we can start those conversations early so that it becomes kind of like ingrained in the family system, by the time 18 happens, it's not like, oh shoot, we have to institute something right now because all of a sudden more freedom's opened up, which goes back to what Greta was saying about a more proactive approach than more of a reactionary approach when that birthday hits and suddenly the landscape changes and the choices change.
I'm a big fan too of getting in the habit of talking about the why behind things that we're doing. I think it's great if children, adolescents, and adults can do this, but to model that as parents, I think is very important as well, especially as our kids get older and can understand kind of what complex issues and reasoning. I'm instituting this boundary, I'm instituting this house rule because this is important to me, this is important to our family, this will be important for you moving forward so that any kind of rules or boundaries don't seem as arbitrary, right? We can get more buy-in from our children if we're able to kind of explain our why and have that, like I said, kind of collaborative approach.
All of this really makes me think actually about two different books I read recently. One is Untethered by Doug Bolton. I don't know if you guys have read that, but it talks a lot about the importance of tethering, of creating connections for kids through and teens and young adults that will last with family or peers or mentors. Just this importance of connection and relationship and this feeling of being tethered so that as life's challenges, whatever they may be, inevitably arise, there are these connections and relationships that securely attached, that all of that is there. And then on the other side is, I'm sure some of you have read The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, that really talks about technology and social media and its impact on kids, I think starting in 2010, but a lot also about this idea of free range parenting, the importance of giving kids appropriate levels of autonomy and how hard it is for parents who feel anxious and want to be really involved. And it's the blessing of the skin knee. I'm now referencing a third book, how we can balance along the way creating connections, relationships, being involved, and letting go a little bit so that kids, as they move through childhood and adolescence and young adulthood, can take chances and can fail and bounce back and build resilience and build grit so that once they reach young adulthood, I think for all parents, our goal is for our kids to be able to be successful, whatever that looks like for them, and to achieve whatever their greatest potential is and to live a meaningful life. And so, this idea of connection and tethering while also letting go and how hard that is for parents, I don't know, it's not two ends of a spectrum. It's all the same goal, but this is all really connecting for me how we can be proactive if we're thinking about it. And it's really hard to not live in the moment sometimes when you're dealing with challenges with the people you love most of the time.
I'm so glad you brought those topics up, Beth, because I I recently also read The Anxious Generation, and I immediately started letting my 5, almost 6-year-old go in. We go to this neighborhood coffee shop, and you can place an online order and then go pick it up inside there, right? So you don't have to order and everything. I've been letting him go in and pick up the order and then come back to the car and like have these little moments of independence and responsibility because previously I didn't think to do that. We would go in together and yeah, just trying to have these little moments. I mean, my son is very far off from being a young adult, but just starting to think about that kind of stuff, right? So, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it's hard not to feel anxious about untethering your your children and letting them go off and do things, but it's so important.
Are you guys seeing with young adults, I know this isn't for everyone, but a lot of what, we stereotypically call helicopter parenting? You hear about the parents who are reaching out directly to their kids, high school teachers, and maybe even university professors on their behalf, or showing up at job interviews. I don't know how often that stuff is happening. But again, I think what you said, this is coming from a place of good intentions and some anxiety for parents. Are we seeing a lot of that? And how can we help support the caregivers in letting things play out and not accidentally sending the message to their kids that they need their parents to be involved?
Definitely seeing it a lot, especially when it comes to college stuff and maybe a parent wanting to send an email to their young adult's advisor or wanting to follow up on certain things, which to a certain extent, again, I think that's another area where the boundaries can get kind of tricky because if we as parents are paying for our child's education, I think that creates another layer of involvement that might need to be there. I love what you talked about with like these trial runs is how I think of them. I think that's something that we can do with our kids earlier on, but also when they're young adults and we're feeling really anxious. Is let's do some of these trial runs, find some of these opportunities to kind of experiment with sitting with discomfort and uncertainty a little bit more. So whether that's, okay, I have Life 360, but I'm going to turn it off for the next 2 days, or I'm going to turn it off during the day and I'll keep it on at night, whatever it is, but make sure that you're having that conversation with your young adults. So you're both on the same page and that there's some transparency there. And I think that those little trial runs are absolutely key.
Do you think that those technologies are and I'm not a parent of a young adult, so I don't know what it feels like to have a young adult out in the world, but do you think that those technologies are detrimental, like the 360 and like that? Like, I know I told my parents where I was. Was I there? I don't know. Like when I was a young adult, is that okay? Like, do you know what I mean? I feel like there was a lot more freedom, whether that was good or bad, I don't know. But I'm just curious what both of your thoughts are on all the technology that we have. And I know obviously for some young adults, it's definitely a positive. Maybe there's something medical involved, or it's really beneficial to have that technology connection to know where they are for a safety reason. But just in general, like, do we think it's a positive, or do we think it's detrimental to a young adult's kind of resilience and development? I'm curious.
I mean, frankly, if I could have everyone on earth take like a 90-day detox from social media and we all just turn it off, I would do that if I could. I think that there are a lot of positives to it. But again, I think it comes back to discernment and what are we doing with the information that we have? Because I've also had some young adults where they have Life 360 as a family. And a lot of my young adults who maybe are really anxious, they keep track of their parents and want to know where they are. Are mom and dad okay? Right. I noticed you got home from work late. Are you feeling stressed out? Right. So I think that the anxiety that can come with the overload of information is pretty universal. So I think it's key about why am I wanting this information? What am I going to do with it? Because if I know my kid's not in class, that's all well and good. But what is my next step? Am I going to check in with them, or am I just going to kind of stew in my own anxiety and discomfort about it?
Is it a parent's place to know, like once they're off at college, is that healthy boundary to know whether they're in class or not? Is that boundary healthy to know whether or not they are? Or is that the young adult's new relationship with their professors? Like they can manage that. I don't know.
It's such a good question because it's so hard to answer, and the best questions are. And so if there's a kiddo who feels like I need the accountability of my parent knowing whether or not I made it to my 8 o'clock art history class. That's a finger pointed at me. That was the class that I always skipped, and my parents didn't know, right? Because we didn't have Life 360 back in whatever that was. I think there are kids who may find that very supportive of like, okay, my parent is going to see if I'm in class or not. That helps get me there, and that's an agreed upon mechanism or part of the family landscape. Great. But if it's not, it's that decision doesn't involve the young adult, then we don't have the ability to answer that question.
Right? Because then your parent can also see where you slept last night. And it wasn't your own dorm room. But also, like, when does it stop? And I don't know what the right answer is, but that can be a helpful mechanism if it's agreed upon and it's important. And at what point then does it become, if we're setting you up for success, again, whatever that looks like, when does that end?
Right. Are we going to be 27 with Life 360 still on in the whole family system? Is that now a normative part of our day? And is that, like Britt said, is it healthy?
Well, then we shift to finding our parents in their 70s and 80s and 90s. And that's a
Yep.
whole other podcast episode.
Yeah. It can be done. I think it doesn't have to end is the answer unless there's conversation and specific intention around communicating of whether or not this is functioning well for us or not. Because if we don't have those conversations and the technology is available and it's designed to be, I don't want to use the word addictive, but it's designed to be enticing at the very least for all parties involved, then the answer is it will stick around unless we make the intentional decision to step back from it. And I think it's a lot harder to step back from this technology, whether it's a tracking app, whether it's social media, than it is to stay connected to it.
Mm-hmm.
And are there other ways for us to get what we're seeking, right? Because really what we're seeking from that is going back to connection, knowledge, some level of kind of certainty, right? To calm our own nerves most of the time. And there is a wide range of things between tracking, right, on Life 360 and never having any communication with your young adult whatsoever, right? So can we instead maybe institute a once weekly quick phone call or FaceTime? Or do we have a family agreement that, yeah, I'm going to text you at 10 a.m. in the morning because I know you're having trouble getting to that class. Was it cool if I just check in with you and make sure you're there? I think there are lots of other ways that we can get what we're looking for that feels maybe more autonomous and less intrusive.
Beth was saying before about like how to start priming some of these helpful habits in earlier years in adolescence so that when young adulthood does come, maybe that weekly check-in or that FaceTime or that family meeting, it's like, all right, you're going to college. We're still going to do that every Sunday at 4 o'clock. And we're already used to it and we already feel like it's helpful for us.
What do you do when whatever the intervention is or the connection is helpful or even necessary and your young adult isn't allowing it? They can turn things off on their phone. They are struggling. I think about, one of the, I don't want to say milestones, but in this country, you're allowed to legally buy and drink alcohol, marijuana in certain states at the age of 21, which is smack dab in the middle of young adulthood. And I'm curious what we're seeing in terms of substance use and abuse trends with young adults in treatment, but also like oftentimes they do need more help. And if a young adult, and it's back to that control conversation, isn't willing to accept that or isn't responding to phone calls, whether it's from a parent or another loved one or a trusted adult who can be a support, what do we do if they're refusing anything in terms of connection or intervention when it's needed?
It's so hard. And again, I'm not a parent of a young adult yet. And the only certain answer in that case is whatever's happening now isn't working. And so it's dropping the rope on the current dynamic, kind of understanding like, all right, my current approach isn't working. It's not getting to me at a place for connection where I'm able to partner with my young adult and come up with some brainstorm that could help them. And that's the first step. And that can be the hardest step is like just stopping what I'm used to doing as a parent or a caregiver.
Modeling consistency, I think, is also key in those situations as well, right? To kind of signal to your young adult that clearly this isn't working right now. You don't want to meet me here, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to continue to support you, even if that looks a little bit different than it has in the past. And I'm always going to be thinking about you. and I'm always going to love you. And I think as long as you can model that and be consistent, hopefully your young adult will kind of come around a little bit, or at the very least, it will make it easier to kind of meet each other in the middle. And I would tap in as well to what other support systems do they have in place? Do they have friends? Do they have professors that they're close to? Do they have people that they see at their job, right? Ideally, do they have their own kind of like therapy team in place if they need it as well? And knowing that that's also part of young adulthood is that they're going to become more integrated and dependent on those sources of support than they are on you as a parent, and that that's also developmentally appropriate. So how do we foster that at the same time?
Yeah, and Greta, I'm really happy you said that because that goes back to what Beth and Britt were saying around like, how do we know whether something is developmentally appropriate or a mental health concern that needs maybe an elevated degree of support? And that's a really wonderful way to kind of discern that is, are they stepping away just from me and they're still connected to their peer group and their academics and maybe their therapeutic supports? Or are they isolating and stepping away from the majority of those communities? That would signal to me more of a mental health concern of, is this a pattern that's persisting across different interpersonal domains and responsibilities, or is it just, wanting a little bit of separation from a caregiver and all the others seem more or less intact?
And this could be happening when your young adult is living in your own home or when they're living across the country or across the world. And parenting in both of those situations looks so different and can be so challenging.
It's so tricky. On the flip side, what does healthy resilience look like in young adulthood? So, what are some signs that parents can kind of hang on to with their young adult that kind of signals that they are building a level of resilience and they are on that developmental track, I guess you could say? Are there things that parents can kind of hold on to?
I think looking to the foundational stuff and the basics is always a good place to start. So I'm talking when it comes to like personal hygiene, when it comes to eating, sleeping, taking your meds, those kinds of things. Again, if we're struggling with severe mental health issues, that might look a little bit different. But I think a healthy young adult is doing those things on their own, feels motivated to do those things, has some buy-in to kind of self-care and then taking care of themselves. I'd also say, is your young adult able to express emotions? There's so many emotions going on at that stage of life, and we got to be able to sit with those and tap into those. Are they able to do that in a way that doesn't totally derail them, right? If they have a tough conversation with a friend, are they able to feel that and still eat dinner that night or still go back to their job in the morning, right? So that resiliency of feeling the emotion and being able to live a life alongside those emotions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I thought that was really well said. And I feel like another marker is a young adult being willing to ask for support when they notice they need it, which almost feels paradoxical to independence. And I think sometimes there's a misconception of independence of either someone is independent or they are dependent. And we even have like a group on this at Compass. It's really about, is a young adult able to balance independence and support from others, because no one gets through life without support from others. And it's a balance of, am I able to make independent decisions? An example of one could be, in this moment, I'm making the independent decision to get some help. And that to me is a marker of someone kind of stepping into their own path, exercising resiliency, knowing themselves well enough to know, hey, I think I do need some support, which in a way is showing that maturity and ability to take that mindful stance of, I don't need to do this on my own, nor should I, and I do have supports I can utilize. And so in a way, that independence is saying, right now I need someone else with me to help.
If a young adult is needing help or asking for help, but they don't really want to talk to their parent about it, who can the parent kind of point them to? I know that's kind of a strange question, but if they feel like their child isn't able to really open up to them, or they feel kind of like they're holding back, what are the next steps in that progression?
Yeah, I would say pointing to other adults that maybe are part of both of your lives, right? Is there like a mutual family friend? Is there someone we know from church or from the hobby that we do every so often that we could kind of talk to about it? I do think therapy is amazing for everyone, regardless if we are struggling with our mental health or not. Young adulthood is a perfect time for folks to kind of explore that, whether that's as a family and we go and see someone and talk to someone and have a dedicated space to do that. Or, hey, you might be struggling with some of this. Totally cool if you don't want to talk to me about it. But is it fine if maybe I help you look for somebody else, right? Like a professional that you could talk to about it. So I think either of those options are good.
It's like that feeling like, "Oh, maybe they aren't able to open up to me as much," but, like, maybe they're really close with their aunt or their uncle or, like, something like that too, right? Like, and you don't have to say that to them, but you could maybe ask that person to reach out to them, and maybe that's, like, an entryway. I'm not sure.
There's like this door number 3 that whenever I'm with patients, I always talk about is when we're kind of in like an emotional spot, we tend to see things as like it's either this or that. And it's either like I talk to my parent or I say nothing. And like it's like, well, what's door number 3? Maybe it's helping them connect with a therapist. Maybe it's bringing in a supportive family member, but at least it's saying like, "Hey, like as long as you're safe, like are you safe? Yes or no? And like I'm going to respect your privacy. It's also clear there's something on your mind. Who are you willing to talk to because we want to make sure that you have support."
And I mean, proactively, can we make sure if your child is college bound and you're going on a tour, just throw in a little question about where's the college counseling center and what do they offer? Or when things aren't particularly stressful or you're thinking about planning ahead, here's how you look up your own local anything, whether it's social connection or you can ask your church or synagogue, just helping to build those skills proactively around how to seek out resources and or this is where resources are should you need them. I think trying to do that when things aren't tense and when there isn't already conflict happening around something hopefully can go a long way.
And that's the difference of that's not the parent or caregiver doing for the young adult. That's support of, let's work on this together. Let's make sure that you know how to do this for yourself if and when you need it, versus the parent, calling and setting up a therapy appointment. It's helping empower or give the young adult the tools to help themselves, but also not leaving them to their own devices and really understanding, well, what are those tools so that I'm informed too, but I'm not necessarily like skipping over the young adult playing a role in their own decision.
Because when we do everything for them, we are sending the message that they can't do it themselves. And it, again, at each age, developmentally, not just chronologically, a certain level of intervention or the parent or caregiver doing is needed and appropriate. But if we don't change that as our kids grow and mature at their own rate, then we are continuing to send the message that they can't, that they don't know how. And I don't mean help and support for mental health concerns, I mean functioning. And that's not anyone's goal.
Diversifying that support system is so key. And I think it is another sign of like healthy young adulthood because I mean, the amount of times that we've been having a great family session and then parents are like, well, I've been telling you this forever. And like, you haven't listened until now. And I think that's such a universal kind of human experience of, I kind of need to hear it from a different source sometimes in order for it to really stick, no matter how long my parents have kind of been telling me this thing.
Yeah, and I think that kind of speaks to our partnerships with universities and colleges too, right? We partner directly with those institutions so that they can better support their students when they are seeking mental health support or to be able to educate the folks in the counseling offices on how they can better support the young adults who might need more support, like at the PHP and IOP level of care. So there's another touch point, right? It's not just on the parents. It gives more responsibility to the young adult to be able to seek out support on their own.
Yeah. Beth also brought up the point of like chronological and developmental and how those two things may look different. And especially for caregivers who may have more than one, you know, kiddo in the family. And back to Greta's point about how in young adulthood our brains are so wired for comparison, and especially with social media where it's so easy to dip into the world of comparisons, just knowing that like someone's chronological age and their development may not always look the same. And so knowing if you have multiple kids in the house, like what each kid needs and what their lived experience is, and making sure that we are kind of seeing each child for their own strengths and their own areas of growth and not making assumptions or kind of lumping everyone in the house under the same expectations. I think that can dissolve some of those innate comparisons, but also form maybe some more healthy and more compatible connections.
I am so glad you brought it up. It's such an important point. How each child within our own family, if there is more than one, or even an extended family with cousins, um, is different and how easy it is to slip into, well, this is what this kid did at this age. So I want to shift gears a little bit. One of the things I hear a lot about, and we mentioned it earlier, is addiction and substance use. So I hear a lot nowadays about young adults with process addictions like gambling, whether it is sports betting or actual gambling, video games, and those kinds of things. And then also substance use addiction, some of which are legal at this age. All of those things are legal once you hit 21 in many states. Talk to us a little bit about what's going on with young adults and various kinds of addictions and what we are seeing, what we need to be doing about it.
Oh, it's such a loaded topic. And when working with the young adult population, I would say it was just every year more and more of this was prevalent in our milieu. What would help me conceptualize, and it was always really nice to partner with Greta on this when we would share cases, is are we talking about like a chemical dependency or are we talking about an emotional dependency? And what is the mechanism behind either or both of those? And so it's also natural when someone's in their young adult stage to be curious and to have more opportunity to try new things. And so that combination of legal ability for access, but also maybe more independence and freedom around the time you have and who's around, and also just the desire to experience something new, or if you've heard about it from friends or social media or wherever, that's kind of a massive collision that sparks some of those behaviors. And then with our brain not being fully developed in terms of its decision making prefrontal cortex, we may not be thinking as mindfully around whether or not it's in our best interest to engage in some of those behaviors. And as we know, a lot of those substances or technologies are designed to be very intriguing and enticing. And so it, to me, is almost like this perfect storm. In terms of an answer, I don't think I have one, but I go back to being proactive before anything happens, discussing some of this in your family system of you're going to be turning 18 or you're going to be turning 21 and you're going to have the ability to access X, Y, or Z. Just know here's some information or here's some things that, it would be helpful for you to know, but also validating that your young adult is going to have some choice, maybe having some meaningful and candid discussion around it before it becomes a problem, while also, as Greta said, like, we're going to have to tolerate the uncertainty of not knowing what our young adult is going to choose in the long run and what impact that choice is going to have. And that's really tough.
This makes me think of something that came up in our episode about screen time. And it's really, how do you know what's problematic? Well, it's really about what could you be doing instead that you aren't doing? And how is this getting in the way of you living your life and your values in the ways that are important? Because, these are sanctioned activities in small amounts of any of them when I'm talking about video games and screen time. And depending on your own personal and family values, sometimes drinking or those kinds of things, it doesn't have to be problematic. And when it starts to get in the way of the things that are important to you or that are important in general in terms of functioning, we have a problem.
And that's the threshold, is what is it getting in the way of, if anything? And if the connection with the family or the caregiver isn't strong, that's when we may not be having honest conversations and things could be happening behind the scenes that we're unaware of. That's the common denominator. If we are experiencing problematic behaviors and we feel like we can safely talk to our supports, we have an inroad. If we feel like we are not, or there's going to be blame or shame, that's when we may not be as honest about what's going on. And we may be finding out at a stage where it's much harder to intervene effectively.
I mean, addiction often, it can thrive in secrecy, right? So I think one of the things we look at for it becoming problematic, regardless of substance, screen time, gambling, whatever it is, like you said, Beth, the impact on functioning and the secrecy around it. Because that's when we really start getting in trouble. We feel like we got to hide those things or we can't be honest about it. And so, as much as it might be painful for us as parents to talk openly about some of these things, it's awkward. It's kind of uncomfortable, right? And we also don't want to feel like we're putting a thought in our young adult's brain that may have not been there before. And I think it's important to remember that we have to confront that these things exist, these things are out there, and our young adult might engage with them. And so we kind of just got to be transparent about it. Something that we use in treatment a lot is called a harm reduction approach, to say, ideally, we wouldn't be engaging in these behaviors at all, but if there's a chance that we're going to, how can we do it as safely as possible? And maybe that means setting rules with your young adult to say, I mean, absolutely, you can't use these substances in the house, right? That's a ground rule. Or maybe it's, if you are going to go to the bar, you're never going to take the car. Let's do an Uber, right? And we come up with these sorts of ground rules for ourselves together to make it as safe and as transparent a conversation as possible.
And I guess, that just kind of got me thinking, if the young adult is living at home through this, um, when you have a teenager in the home, there can be natural consequences for actions, right? If something happens, there can be a natural consequence. Maybe the phone has to go away for a certain amount of time, or there can be consequences. Does that change when they're a young adult? How does that dynamic work?
I'd say consequences are still often necessary. The type of consequence absolutely changes, and being able to set and enforce those boundaries doesn't, right? Because that's also a skill we just need as humans in adulthood as well. So maybe it doesn't look so much like I'm taking away your phone, but I don't know of many young adults who are paying their own phone bill right now either. I think most of them are on like family plans, right? So maybe it looks like I'm going to stop contributing to that or paying that for you. Or maybe it looks like, you can't have your friends over, right? I think a lot of those consequences do still need to exist. They're just going to look a little bit differently, and we might run into a little more friction with them as well.
And Greta, you mentioned before, like trial periods. We can always do a trial period of, okay, I'm going to take myself off your bank account for a month and see how it goes. And then if we notice that money's going to, I don't know, it just was brought up, like a gambling app, and it's getting in the way of you having enough to feed yourself or focusing class, whatever, then I'm popping myself back on starting the first of the next month. I think there's always time to experiment and explore without anything being set in stone or a forever decision.
That just makes me think of the scene in Reality Bites where Winona Ryder has her dad's gas card, but he's cut her off. And so she goes to the gas station and fills everyone's car with gas and gets the cash back so she can spend it on whatever she wants. I always thought that was brilliant.
I haven't seen that. That sounds brilliant.
You haven't seen Reality Bites? None of you. Okay.
Classic 90s.
Please go back and watch it while we're talking about young adulthood. Thank you.
Gonna add it to the list. Okay, I know we have, a little bit of time left. Do we want to dig into AI a little bit? And if those conversations are coming up for your young adults and their families, I'm going to spit out a stat here because I think it's interesting. Harvard, in their Making Caring Common project in 2023, they reported that 45% of young adults said that they had a general sense that things are falling apart and that this was impairing their mental health. They also reported that young adults said that they had a sense of not mattering to others, 44%, and that 34% reported loneliness. And so I'm curious if you're seeing conversations about AI kind of entering in terms of loneliness and disengaging with peers or anything like that. Is that coming up in the family therapy room and the group rooms?
Not so much in the family therapy space specifically, but definitely just with our young adults in general. And I'll refrain from completely getting on my soapbox about AI and the use of that here. But in terms of the connection piece, again, I think this also goes back to a lot of our folks coming of age during the height of the pandemic, where we had to rely on these things to have social connection and to combat isolation. The state of the world is really, really difficult now, and we know all about it, right? And we can't really escape that. What's most important, I think, to remember is that combating our loneliness and our isolation with AI tools is probably only going to kind of exacerbate those issues in the long run. It's going to feel good and comforting temporarily. And we got to remember that we're not engaging with an actual person. We are engaging with a thing that is not sentient and, cannot truly engage with us on the level that we as humans need to engage on. So I think it can definitely have its limited uses for sure. And overall, I think reminding our young adults that we need the socialization as human beings, and that's going to feel more uncomfortable than like opening up ChatGPT and kind of having a convo with it is. And it is going to be so much more sustaining and beneficial for us in the long run.
Mm-hmm. And you read these stories about folks using AI to kind of discuss their mental health. Can we kind of touch on that from your perspective, how problematic that can be?
Oh, again, it's so new. And just like any technology, there's benefits and there's also drawbacks. And like thinking about like Facebook's been around for how many years? How many decades? At least two.
There are no young adults on Facebook, Melissa.
I know, and I'm not either. I'm not either anymore. And like we're just starting to see legal ramifications for something that's been around for over 2 decades. And so thinking about AI that's been around for much less than that, especially in the chatbot form, it's going to be unfortunately the same pattern of we're going to learn about things in a reactionary way, and we already are before any precedent or law is set to safeguard against the harm. And that to me is very, very scary. That being said, that doesn't mean we can't have conversations and try to get ahead of it with our young adults so that we can help them develop that intentionality of, okay, I have these pieces of technology available for me. What am I looking to get out of this? And why am I using it? And I think of like something that I talk about with patients and families sometimes is like before, during, after. Like, how am I feeling before? How am I feeling during this use? And how am I feeling after compared to alternatives that I have available to me? And I think about too, like sitting face to face with someone, communication isn't just the words that we're putting back and forth. It's also nonverbals. It's also eye contact. It's also someone feeling connected and heard and known. And if those are the needs we're looking for and we're going to a chatbot, what are the barriers to doing that with an actual other human being where we know it's more sustainable and healthier for us because that's how we have survived in the company of others and in community. And that's the word I come back to is community. It's thinking about, okay, if people are turning to chatbots for connection, what are the limitations? What are the barriers getting in the way of forming community where they are at school, within their family system, within their social environment? And that's what I'd like to look deeper into because I feel like that's the information that we're currently missing when someone is turning to AI for those needs.
Another important piece too, and this circles back to what you were saying before, Melissa, is these programs, they're designed to keep you engaged
Yes.
and designed to keep you hooked. And so if you were to talk to it, right, a chatbot about kind of your mental health issues or anything else, its goal is not to give you something so you can leave that behind and kind of do that work in the real world. Its goal is to keep you engaged with it and engaged with that program. It's in a way, it's learning from you. You're not really learning from it, right? It's kind of taking your information. And so, yeah, I think keeping in mind what is its goal and what's my goal, and are those two things matching up or not?
And what am I getting from this chatbot that I may not be getting from my supports? Maybe the chatbot is designed to just validate me endlessly. That, of course, feels amazing. And it might be signaling, hey, maybe I feel like I'm not getting the validation that feels encouraging from my supports. Maybe that's a conversation we have is, hey, I know whenever we talk, it seems like we just kind of go into problem solving on how I can get to class. But what I really need is you just to hear my feelings. And if that conversation can happen, maybe the need for that chatbot isn't as potent. I don't know. That's just an example I'm throwing out there. But it's always thinking about what's the need we're trying to meet and how do we meet that need in maybe a healthier way.
Yeah. Maybe a parent kind of has an inkling that their young adult or their teen is using AI to kind of voice their concerns, talk about their mental health, or just have these connections. How would you suggest that they bring up that topic to their young adult? What's a good way to enter that conversation without it feeling combative or anything like that? What's a good way to approach it?
The curiosity piece, I just always go back to it, right? Because that's really what we are. We're curious about what our young adult is doing and why. I think approaching it with stating your own observations, right? And going back to I statements are an oldie but a goodie for a reason, right? In therapy, that we're stating what we're observing and how we're feeling and what we're noticing, and then explaining, can you tell me a bit more about that? And I think going back to what you said, Melissa, about what are you looking for from it? And then having kind of a forward conversation from there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I go back to what you said, Greta, of like, if there is a mutual conversation of there's a pattern of behavior that maybe isn't what the young adult is really looking for or is maybe a bit concerning, and that concern can be heard, it's going back to that trial period of like, do we think that maybe for the next 2 days we turn off the app and see how you feel and talk about it at the end of that 2-day period and just kind of think about, like, what did you notice? Did you feel any differently? What were the challenges? What were the benefits? And like taking things in small steps versus either engage without oversight or you have to be completely done with whatever this technology is. I think those small steps is where we can get a little bit of buy-in and do a little bit of experimenting and partner with a young adult versus seeing things in such a dichotomous way.
Man, it must be such a interesting time to be a young adult and a university student or about to enter into the workforce. And it must be such an unsettling time for those going through the university years. I know we're all feeling it as professionals, so they must be feeling it as well.
Actually, this conversation is giving me a lot of hope. I feel like one of my takeaways is it's not too late. When I thought about young adults, especially spending most of my time working with children, adolescents, and families, I always think of young adult like, okay, well, they've turned 18. And so you guys are making me feel like, yes, there are a lot of things we want to try and do proactively, and it's never too late to intervene. And there are a lot of ways to approach this as young adulthood looks so different for everyone. If there's one thing that you would want parents to remember about supporting young adults or even the experience of young adulthood, I would love to hear from each of you, just like one takeaway.
You got to muddle through it together, right? It's not clear. There's no manuals, and we're each discovering something new, you and your adult, right? And we want to figure it out together, and keeping that connection is what's gonna help ensure healthy continued development and adulthood for your kid.
I think mine would be, and this goes against sometimes my programming when I get into maybe an emotional space, especially with my kiddo who's nowhere near young adulthood, is just try to embrace that it is messy, even if we feel or think that it shouldn't be, and also to slow down in the moments where we have the urge to go fast.
Okay, one last question before we have to wrap. I would also love to hear from both of you some tips for parents. How can parents manage their own anxiety or feelings of uncomfort so that they can stay steady and be a consistent presence during this stage in their child's life?
Number one, I'm going to put in a plug for therapy. Getting your own therapist and just having a dedicated person you can get all those feelings, all those thoughts out on is going to be key. Building up some self-compassion and grace for yourself as a parent is so important. And just kind of reminding yourself when it gets hard that I love my kid and we'll get through this. But have some grace for yourself.
I agree with that. I think it's really hard. The term I come back to is like love is a verb. So how are we expressing our love in actions? Our young adult can't read our minds and we can't read theirs. And the only way that we're going to be able to understand is through communication. And we can only communicate effectively if we're in a place where we can access both our emotions and our logic. And so if making sure that both parties are in that kind of centered space, that's where we're going to have our best conversations and really be able to form that connection and community.
I love that. That was, I think, a perfect place for us to end. You both are amazing. Thank you so much for being here and talking with us about this complex but really important topic.
I'm just really still stuck on that you guys haven't seen that movie. I feel really old. As we wrap up today, one of the biggest takeaways is that young adults are navigating more decisions than ever before during a time when the decision-making part of the brain is still developing. Understanding that can shift how we show up as parents and caregivers.
And any plan, any next step, it only works if your young adult is genuinely part of making it. That buy-in is what makes the difference. So lead with curiosity, keep the door open for conversation, and remember that connection matters more than getting it perfectly right.
Healthy resilience can look like taking care of the basics, feeling hard emotions without being derailed by them, and knowing when to ask for help. Give yourself and your young adult grace in this process.
And for the parents and caregivers listening, it's okay if this stage feels messy and uncertain. As Melissa reminded us today, try to slow down when you feel the urge to fix things. Give yourself the same grace you're trying to give your child, because you only know what you know, and that's okay.
Before we go, we want to leave you with a small reminder to check in with yourself today. Not just with your young adult, not just your to-do list, but with you. How are you doing? What do you need right now? You can't pour from an empty cup, and taking care of yourself is part of taking care of them.
If today's conversation resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to You Only Know What You Know wherever you listen to your podcasts. It helps more parents and caregivers find us.
You can also follow us at Compass Health Center on social. We would love to hear from you. Send us a message or drop a comment and let us know what topics you're interested in. You're not alone in this. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next time.